Yo, what's up, chefs? It's Vinny, and this is my end-game non-crit Spark Sorceress build guide. But before we hop into it, let me just show you what it's capable of. This is a T4 Zesht, 4 people. I'm going to be soloing it. Let's see how it goes. As always, we have the max roll planner, we have the POE planner, and of course, we have the full trade links Google document with a bunch of extra information packed in here. This is going to be all of your items, a bunch of extra info, etc., etc. I've also gone ahead and included all of the trade links down in the description below for quick access in case you're not interested in the extra info provided on the Google document. Before we get into the details, just a quick disclaimer that this is a decently min-maxed setup at this point. It cost us right around 100 to 150 divine for our whole setup, which may sound like a lot, but honestly for what it's capable of, I would say it's quite cheap, especially when compared to some other setups and builds that have a nearly indistinguishable level of power, but cost well over 1,000 divine or even sometimes more than a mirror. It's also very important to note that you are not required to spend nearly as much as I did. You can have the build fully online, about 80% as strong, capable of destroying everything in the game except for maybe T4 Simulacrum for like 1/4 of the cost, and you will be good to go. Simulacrum is not even really that profitable at this point. It's just extremely, extremely difficult, and it's kind of just like a completionist thing if you want to be able to check it off the list. With all of that out of the way, I'm not going to spend too much time on kind of the basics and general stuff, and instead I'm going to be primarily focusing on the specifics and details of how we min-maxed our setup to show you exactly how to get your build online, one-shotting bosses just like you saw in the intro. So let's get started. Super quickly, before anything else, this is not directly related to the Spark guide, but this is something that's going to make your life a lot easier regardless of what build you're playing, and of course for this build as well. There's actually a way to copy and paste items from the trade website directly into Path of Building in order to compare them to what you're currently using to see if it's an upgrade. I'll be including a link to this Google Chrome extension in the description down below. I know it's also an extension on Mozilla Firefox, but I don't have the link for that. All you have to do though is once you get added to Chrome, you can then, I'll just briefly demonstrate it. If I go to focus here, all you have to do is open up the trade website. I'll sort by sum and you get this nice little export option. If I click export, I can then go into my Path of Building. I can add that to build, and then my current focus is this one right here. This is what I'm currently using, but now I can compare it to the new one that I just imported. I can see that I'm going to lose average hit, but I'm actually going to gain hit DPS, and it's just a very nice way to compare things and see if it's actually going to be an upgrade for you. First things first, I'm going to go over the skills, and more importantly, the core mechanics of where the damage actually comes from and how we're able to scale that so high with this build. First up, we have Spark. We're running Arcane Tempo, Acceleration, Overcharge, Lightning Exposure, and Considered Casting. Keep in mind, for bosses, I do swap out Acceleration for Controlled Destruction, but that's just to be able to like see just how quick we can kill the boss. You're more than fine just leaving Acceleration in, and you'll kill the boss in like a second instead of half a second. Worth keeping in mind there. For the Flame Wall, we have Spell Cascade, Fortress, and Fire Mastery. Conductivity, the reason it says slot 2 here is because this is used by our second weapon set, the Chiming Staff. So this will not get used by your Wand or Shield. If you want to see precisely how to get 2 weapon sets set up, In the most recent build update video I made, I go into, extensive detail on exactly how to get it set up. I'd recommend checking that out for kind of like a walkthrough. But conductivity getting used with our second weapon, we're going to be running Heightened Curse, Focused Curse, and Cursed Ground. Cursed Ground is an added thing since the previous video, and it is quite helpful because this allows you to put conductivity down before a boss comes out, which means once the boss is actually attackable, you don't have to swap your weapons at all. You can just be spamming Spark the whole time. Next up, we have Cast on Shock, Lightning Conduit, Impetus, Energy Retention, Rising Tempest, and Elemental Focus. The only difference here between this and our previous video is we have Rising Tempest instead of Concentrated Effect. Concentrated Effect, for some reason, is just kind of bugged with Lightning Conduit. It only reduces the area of effect and does not increase the area of effect damage. So instead, we're using Rising Tempest. And then finally, Archmage with Lightning Mastery, Blink on our second weapon set with Ingenuity. So to be clear, you only need 160 Spirit, because for your weapon set 1, you'll be running Archmage, Cast on Shock, which is 160 Spirit. And for your second weapon set, you're only running Blink and Cast on Shock, which is only 120. So total, just 160 Spirit. I get a lot of questions about Spirit, so I just thought I would clarify that super quick. Moving on to potentially the more important topic, which is going to be the core mechanics, where the damage actually comes from, and how to actually scale it. The POE damage calculation can be pretty complicated, so I'm just going to do my best to oversimplify it. If you're not interested in the nitty-gritty stuff, feel free to skip ahead to the next segment. But if you are interested in really understanding how to min-max your damage, then this may be perfect for you. In order to understand how we do it with this build, you have to have a general understanding of the damage calculation by default, so let me break that down just a little bit. Once again, going to be oversimplified. I'm going to use two types of increases to your damage to illustrate this, two that you're probably familiar with. One is going to be increased damage, and the other one is going to be more damage. And also your base damage is pretty important here as well. So for example, let's say you have 100 base damage with Spark, and then if you go into your passive tree, you can see here, you get this 10% increased spell damage, and then you also get this 40% more damage with spell hits. These different types of increases to your damage, you can think of them like buckets. So base damage would be a bucket, increased damage would be a bucket, and more damage would be a different bucket. Different buckets multiply with one another to create your damage. Things within the same bucket add together. So, for example, if you have 100 base spark damage, and then you have 10 different instances of 10% increased damage, so maybe you've got 35% increased spell damage, you've got 35% increased lightning damage, and 30% increased projectile damage. That's an additional 100% damage. Base damage of Spark 100, that would be 100 times 2, or times 1 plus 0.35 plus 0.35 plus 0.3 for those individual increases, resulting in 100 times 2 for 200 damage. The reason why these different buckets are important, though, is when you start to add in more of them. So we'll add in more damage as an example. Say everything else is the same, or you keep everything the same, you've got 100 times 2 from the 3 separate instances of increased damage, but now you've also got 100% more damage from, let's just say, support gems. So now it's 100 times 2 times 2. The reason why this is important is if you look at the calculator, the way that you could do this, if you just had 100 base and then you had 100% increased projectile and 100% increased spell, it would look like this. 100 times 3, you would get 300. But if you have 100 base and then you have 100% increased and 100% more, it would look like this. 100 times 2 times 2, resulting in 400. So you're getting more damage by getting multiple buckets. Like I said, this is a pretty huge oversimplification. If you want to learn more about that, I recommend checking out the wiki. There's also a bunch of Reddit threads that go into a lot of detail. But a lot of the way you scale your damage in the end game, regardless of what build you're playing, is by dipping in and filling up multiple of these buckets that can then all multiply against one another to create a very large number at the end, as opposed to just going full send into one bucket. Like getting 1,000% increased spell damage is going to be infinitely less effective than getting 10 different buckets of 100% increased, 100% more, 100% shock, 100% exposure, etc., etc. The list goes on. So now that hopefully you have a general understanding of the damage calculation, what are our buckets that we're using to scale our damage? Well, they can primarily be broken down into just a few different categories. One, of course, is going to be increased damage. We get a lot of increased damage from our passive tree. You're also going to be getting increased damage from your wand, increased lightning damage, probably get some from your focus, and maybe even get some from your rings, as we do. After that, after increased, we're going to have more damage. This is going to be a separate bucket once again. The places that we're getting more damage are far less, or there's like a lot less ways to get more damage, but some of the primary ones would be considered casting on our spark. When we do bosses, of course, we put in controlled destruction as well. And then for our lightning conduit, we have elemental focus and rising tempest. All of these are more. Once again, different bucket gets multiplied against increased and the base. After more damage, the next one is going to be gained. Once again, separate bucket. The primary way we're getting gained damage is through Archmage. So for every 100 maximum mana you get, you're getting 9% gained damage as extra lightning damage. Of course, our current setup with 7,200 mana, that's going to be 9 times 72. That's going to be 648, which is 6.48. It's a 6.48 multiplier on everything else. And then finally, the last main way that we're going to, or there's actually two more. The next one would be shock. Shock, the way it reads, it can be a bit complicated because when you look at it, it kind of looks like it's just increased because it says causes targets to take 20% increased damage. But that to take part actually makes it a different bucket. So once again, a new multiplier. And then finally, the last one is going to be monster resistance. Usually, and actually always, monster resistance will always happen at the end of every damage calculation, whether you're doing physical damage against armor or elemental damage against an elemental resistance, it will always happen at the very, very end. However, for us, and usually this would be like a reduction to your damage, if you're doing 400 damage and the enemy boss has 75% resistance, the very end of the calculation, you would only be doing 100 because you're doing 25% damage. But in our case, we are reducing enemy resistance by 145%. 70% of that is coming from our exposure, which of course we have lightning exposure on our spark for this reason, so that way our lightning conduit can get amplified by this. And then also the other 75% is coming from our conductivity, which is why these second weapon swap nodes for the curse effectiveness are quite valuable in that regard. Just to illustrate this with the calculator to maybe make it make a little bit more sense, let's assume we have 200 base damage of our spark, and I'll kind of show you what this calculation would look like. So we have 200 base damage. Let's say we have 150% increased damage. That's maybe 50% increased lightning, 50% increased spell, and 50% increased projectile. This is obviously hypothetical, but that would be 200 times 2.5. Now, let's say our shock, which this is not hypothetical, our shocks are 75% effect per shock, which is 150% total. So that would be 500 times 2.5 for that shock. Now we're all the way up to 1250. Up next, our Archmage. We have 7,200 mana. Our Archmage is a 6.48 multiplier. So 1250 times 6.48. Now we're all the way up to 8,100. You can start to see why this gets a bit crazy. After that, what's our next one? I actually had them written down in this beautiful MS Paint. So we had increased, we have shock, we have gained. Now we have more. This one's going to be kind of hypothetical, kind of not really. For our spark damage, we're going to have 70% more when we're fighting bosses because of considered casting and controlled destruction. So that would be a times 1.7. Now we're up to 13,770. And then finally, monster resistance. If we're fighting Zesht, who has 50% lightning res, and we're reducing it by 145%, that would put him at negative 95%, which would be a 1.95 multiplier. So now 13,770 times 1.95. This is how, even from a base damage of 200, we get all the way to 26,851. Of course, our spark damage is way above 200 at a base. It looks like currently 30 to 570. And then technically your base is also plus added. I'm not actually sure if we have any sources of added damage currently in this build. I want to say we don't, but hopefully that gives you an idea of why having multiple buckets is very important. Going into a bit more detail on where those buckets get increased from. So you already understand more is obviously coming from considered casting, controlled destruction. You obviously already understand the monster resistance is coming from exposure and conductivity. Exposure is being juiced up by these three nodes right here. This is 50% increased exposure effect, to be clear, and then 25% increased exposure effect. And exposure is naturally 20% by itself. You can see right there, 20% to the specified resistance, but the Stormweaver Ascendancy tree has an additional 20%. So the calculation there is 20 plus 20 equals 40, and then we multiply that by 1.75 because we have 75% increased exposure effect, resulting in 70% exposure. And if you go back and look at the intro, whenever we kill any of the bosses, you'll see the little exposure symbol, 70%. Our conductivity is all the way up to 75% due to these increased effective curse nodes here and here, as well as the support gems that we have socketed. So you understand increased, you understand more, you understand gain, you understand monster res. For shock, shock is also quite simple. Shock by default is 20% effect. The way you increase that is increasing the magnitude of your shock. We're getting magnitude of shock from our passive tree in a couple of different places. Here. So 25%, 20%, 10%, 10%, 10%. Then we're also getting another 30% right here. And then finally, we're getting more of it from our jewels. We have many jewels with increased magnitude, 20%, 14%, 13%, 18%, 14%, and 19%. So you take all those increases to your magnitude of shock, you multiply that, or you multiply 20 times all of those increases. All of those increases are additive with one another, and that results in your total shock effectiveness, which ours currently is sitting at 75% effect per shock for a total of 150%, which is where that 2.5 came from earlier in our little demonstrated damage calculation on the calculator. Now, I know that was quite complicated and probably a lot of information to process, but hopefully it gives you a slightly better understanding of precisely why our damage is so high, especially for bosses with our lightning conduit. Some of this stuff is a bit more important here because you can see we get 100% more damage with hits per 5% shock effect on enemy. So when we consume 175% shock, that is giving us, pull up the calculator once again. POE is just a calculator game at this point, but if we're consuming a 75% shock, 75 divided by 5 is going to be 15. So that's 1,500% more damage on our lightning conduit, which is, a whole different bucket, that more bucket, which would be a 15 multiplier. And then on top of that, there's still going to be one shock active on the enemy when the lightning conduit goes through. Sometimes there'll actually be 2 shocks active on the enemy because we have, for bosses, I recommend you don't have to, but you can take this node. There's ways that you can give a chance on consuming a shock on an enemy to reapply it. So sometimes when your lightning conduit goes off, there's 2 shocks active on the enemy. and you just get this crazy amount of added multipliers coming in and just making your lightning conduit do literally like 30 million damage in one hit. And it can get pretty nuts, of course. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm not going to go over like too much of the basic stuff, so I'm not really going to go over the passive tree and like all the different nodes. I will just say a couple of the important nodes, of course, are going to be pure power, giving us that increased lightning damage per 10 intelligence. With our current setup, we've got 344 intelligence, so that is 34 times 2, 68% increase to lightning damage just from that one node. There's quite a few places that you can get increased lightning exposure effect. Since monster resistance is its own bucket, I highly recommend you get these increases to your lightning exposure here and here. A lot of the like places that I've done research for this build when I was, leveling it up and everything, build guides I was looking at, videos I was watching, etc., I saw very few people recommending these nodes. Actually, let me take that back. I didn't see anybody recommend taking these nodes or even this node, I don't think. But if you ask me, it is 100% worth it. The exposure, like I said, that monster resistance, it's its own separate bucket. So increasing it in the few places you have the option to, I think is a no-brainer. Magnitude of shock, we've got some really good magnitude of shock nodes over here. See very few people recommend taking these. And truth be told, one of the only reasons we are able to take it is because we're not going crit. I haven't talked much about the crit stuff yet, but when you don't go crit, there's a lot of nodes freed up. You don't have to get these or these or these or these. That gives you a lot more room to play around with. Allows us to come over here and get Wild Storm, but also get all of this shock magnitude, which is super juicy. Outside of that, we do have the trigger spell nodes up here, mainly because we've got our Against the Darkness slotted up here. Ever since we went away from no energy shield, or now that we have no energy shield, we're not taking any of these nodes. Like this was for crit, all of this was for energy shield. We're not taking that anymore, so we moved our Against the Darkness over to the top right side of the tree, and we just filled in all of these nodes for the fire resistance and increased maximum mana. And of course, the increased meta skill energy gain is quite nice. Since we're on that topic, I'll just briefly mention that the breakpoint for your energy gain right here is 150%. There is one that's quite a bit higher, around like 190 or 200, but I would say that's not super realistic to get to without like over investing into it. The reason why 150% is the breakpoint, just to illustrate it for you really quick, when you put Lightning Conduit in, it gives you a maximum energy of 300. That's due to the 1 second base cast time, and then the additional plus 1 second. If you look at energy, it says when calculating energy gain or consumption from the use time of a skill, modifiers to total use time are treated as though they were double the value. So that plus 1 second is actually like 200 energy. That's why it's 300. We are getting 2 energy per power of shocked enemies. Unique monsters always have 20 power, so pinnacle bosses, bosses in general are going to be unique, 20 power. 20 times 2 is 40, so by default, you're getting 40 energy per shock. If you have a 150% increase, you can multiply that 40 by 1.5, gives you 60, and then if you divide 300 by 60, you get 5. So if you have a 150% energy gain modifier, that brings you exactly to that clean, crisp 6 shocks per lightning conduit. Of course, if you only had 145%, this is why it's important just to show you, 40 times 1.45 would be 58. If I were to do 58 times 5, because before we needed only 5 shocks if you get up to 150%, now with 5 shocks, you would be at 290 energy. You would not be at that 300, so you need an additional shock. You need a whole another, you need 6 shocks now instead of just 5. So I would say 150% is a really good breakpoint if you're trying to min-max. I think it is worth it. Other than that, the rest of the passive tree should be pretty basic and self-explanatory, especially if you're paying attention to the previous segment where we went over the different buckets and how we're scaling our damage. Should make sense pretty easily. And of course, you can copy it on the max roll and POB planner. You'll be able to see it in full detail there. Video is getting a bit long, so I don't want to waste any more of your time going over each individual node. Moving on to the items, similarly here, you can find all of the items in the POE and Max Roll Planner, so I'm not going to go over all of them individually, and instead I'm going to highlight the ones that have changed since the most recent build update video. Previously, we had a wand with increased critical hit chance of our spells. Since we are no longer going crit, we of course got rid of that. We also upgraded to a +5 wand, but all of the other stats are very similar to what we talked about before and what you'll find in the trade link. Of course, all of the trade links will have you covered. You'll get items almost identical to everything I'm wearing here, but a +5 wand, cast speed, intelligence, high mana, all the good stuff. Also, very notably, we swapped away from a 60 spirit chest piece. We are now using the Warrior Invictus with increased maximum mana and all elemental resistances per socketed rune or soul core. And we're using 5 soul cores with 2% increased mana each. So that's 10% increased max mana plus 25% increased maximum mana from the modifier. So goes without saying that the chest piece is giving us a ton of additional mana, which does result in a lot of additional damage as well. The all elemental resistances, I go into some detail on this on the trade links document. You could swap that out for all increased attributes for a little bit more damage, but that would kind of make sorting your resistances on the rest of your gear a bit of a nightmare. And if you get all elemental resistances on the chest piece, it makes it very easy. You don't need to get resistances on your rings. You can focus on damage there. It's super simple. It's definitely what I would recommend. Since we are no longer getting spirit from our chest piece, we had to get rid of the Everlasting Gaze, which is why we no longer have any energy shield, and we're fully reliant on our mana from Mind Over Matter. And of course, we have a lot of mana regeneration, so we're still very, very tanky. It is extremely hard to die. Honestly, the only way I feel like I can even die at this point is if I just get like hit by a 1 in a million freeze. But even then, when you get frozen, you can still use your mana flask while frozen. This brings you back to full mana, so it's so hard to die. It's nearly impossible, I would say, if you're not like falling asleep at the wheel. But with that being said, we do now get the spirit from our amulet. Once again, trade link is going to have you covered. We have a really, really nice one here, to be fair. The trade link is going to find you something probably a tiny, like a smidge worse than this, just because we are at the end of the league, so there's less options. But you can find options very similar to this for a reasonable price, of course. And you'll get that 60 spirit, which will still allow you to use Cast on Shock. And like I said, the trade link's going to have you covered on that. Guarantee it. Additionally, we swapped out from the Mahu Shield to a Focus. We got this Focus for a steal, which was just very nice. I spent some time looking around in the middle of the night, was able to snipe one for a really good price, but you can find one similar to this for about 15 to 20 divine. Ideally, you're looking for that +2 level of all spell skills, but, copying the item on the website and importing it to POB and checking is definitely worth it, because you can find focuses with just +1 level or even no levels that are still really good if they have enough of the other good stats. So it's definitely worth checking, making sure you're using that weighted sum filter that is, findable on the trade link. Outside of that, most of the other stuff, obviously we have upgraded them, but they're still very similar. Like our boots are upgraded, but they're extremely similar. Just intelligence, resistance, mana, energy shield. We still have an ingenuity. We just increased the bonuses gained up to 78%. Gloves, we got rid of the crit damage bonus, replaced that with rarity. Helmet, now we've got rarity as well. Our rings are very similar. We've got one ring with mana regen. Both of them have lightning damage. We went all out on the damage for the rings. Cast speed, mana, intelligence, lightning damage, mana regen. And dexterity doesn't hurt because you do need a fair bit of dex and strength for the Warrior Invictus. So we got strength from the necklace, dexterity from the ring. Quite nice. In regards to mana, because I can already envision there's going to be a lot of people curious about the mana regen. It's very important to note that you don't need like 1-to-1 mana regen to your mana cost if you get recover % mana on kill. Go over this in the trade links document, but the sweet spot in my experience is anywhere from 2 to 6%. 2% is a little low. 6% is kind of overkill. I'm currently running 6%. I've got 2% here, 2% here, and 2% here. This allows me to basically do T4 Simulacrum with my eyes closed. I can just spin around in a circle, spam Spark, and I'm killing enough enemies that I'm recovering so much mana from that I basically can't run out of mana. So keep that in mind. If you're struggling with mana, trying to get jewels with recover percent mana on kill is a very, very good way to go about it. And they're not super expensive. Like all of my jewels were about 5 divine or less, except for my controlled metamorphosis, which was I think 9 divine. But it's a unique jewel. It is what it is. And other than that, I mean, like I said, all the items you can find in the planners, and the trade links are going to have you covered 100% of the way. Keep in mind, it is the end of the trade league. I cannot make any guarantee exactly on what price you're going to find these items for. I do have the max prices set though. Like the most expensive one is 20 divine for the wand. I think it's 20 divine for the focus, 20 divine for the amulet. Most of the other ones are 10 divine or less. The jewel max price filter is set to 5 divine or less. So it's not going to be, it's going to be about the same price that I paid. And I went through all those trade links, made sure you're finding very comparable, nearly identical items to what I'm currently using, or even in some cases, actually better. And I think that's going to go ahead and wrap up the guide. I know this one was a bit different than some of the previous guides. I didn't do much of an overview. I kind of skipped over a lot of the basics. If you want to see more of the basics and like a general overview for this build, I highly recommend checking out my leveling and early end game guide. I cover everything there in a lot of detail. I didn't want to like regurgitate a lot of that same information. I wanted to go into more of the specifics, the nitty gritty, and like exactly how you're min-maxing your damage to get those nice crispy one-shots that I was showcasing in the intro. Hopefully you guys appreciated that. If not, if you want me to like stick to more of the general overview and just kind of let the calculations happen in the background and you don't have to worry about it, feel free to let me know in the comments and I'll go back to that methodology. But moving forward, I think this is a pretty good idea where the leveling and endgame guide is more of like an overview, the basics, give you the conceptualization of what we're going for, and then once we get to the higher investment, deeper endgame versions, giving you more of the specifics and exactly what is making everything work in the background. Other than that, like I said, hope you guys enjoyed. Have fun with the Spark build, and good luck blasting. And last but not least, take it easy, chefs.
As you fade away.